Good evening, everyone. It's actually very impressive to see so much interest in a topic like healthcare startups. But I must say one thing. You guys are very fortunate that India is actually going to grow so dramatically over the next few years, and you'll have the chance to be a part of it. How do I do my next? Okay. I'm going to spend about 5 minutes. I know we're running a little bit late, so if I went through the entire thing, it would take maybe about 30. But I think there's a lot of misconception about what angel investing involves, and a lot of people think it's a bit like gambling. And people think sometimes angel investors, we think of ourselves as being angels, but a lot of startup founders think of ourselves being devils, paisa lete hai aur kuch dete nahi hai. So sometimes it becomes a bit of a conflict situation. Who gets the upper hand? Is it going to be the founder because he can get the money and run away with it? Or is it going to be the investor? And I think if you remember this story, really we need to keep on reminding ourselves that we're both on the same side. And I think that's something which the panel discussion is going to talk about, because there's always this tension and conflict in the room, and that's something we need to address. Having said all this, I think I need to emphasize the fact that we are all learning. Just because I happen to be sitting on the stage along with all these other people does not mean that we have the answers. All of us are learning along with you, and presumably you will be able to teach us a lot. The most important thing, I think, in the entire ecosystem is what I think of as integrity. It's something which sometimes we take for granted, but sometimes it isn't. And when you come across either a crooked founder who says things and doesn't deliver, or a crooked investor for that matter, who promises money and then doesn't give it, it damages the trust in the entire ecosystem, and everyone gets hurt in the process. I think a lot of founders think of a startup as being like this. I'm going to come up with a bright idea and then be able to sell it. And unfortunately, that's always not true, because you then have a solution and then you go looking for a market who will buy it. I think this is far more realistic. You first need to identify a problem, and you need to think whether you can provide a solution which someone else hasn't been able to do. And the reason I've put up this slide is I often find that, when people come from IITs and IIMs, they always think, okay, we know everything, we're the cream of the crop, which is sometimes a problem with universities like Ahmedabad University, because you feel, we're not from IIT. And I think don't treat yourself as second-class citizens, and don't let anyone else treat you as second-class citizens. The brand name doesn't really matter at all. And in fact, the amount of good you guys can do is far more, because you're much more in direct contact with what the problems are. And I think it's always worth remembering this, that it's not really a question of who has the answers. The trouble with some people is they think they have all the answers, and they never figure out they're wrong until it's too late. I think it's much more important to be able to ask intelligent questions. And that's something which all of us can do. Again, I think this is important. When you think you already know everything, you're not going to be able to learn anymore. But if you're always trying to figure out what's happening, you will be able to find out a lot. I think this is a big hurdle, and I think there's a lot of mystique and jargon about becoming an entrepreneur and, what's your business plan and how do I raise money, all that stuff. Again, remember, all this stuff is very easy to learn. It's not hard. Of course, you will have things like Venture Studio who will hold your hand, but once you're determined, most of it is just applied common sense. Don't get too carried away. The big problem with any pitch is the standard answer from an investor is always going to be no. It's much easier for me to say no, because I get 100 requests for funding. And if I keep on saying yes to them, I'll run out of money, and I can't afford that either. And this is the big problem with the way founders think of investors. Especially, for example, places in Gujarat where you think of businessmen as being fat banias who made a lot of money but are not willing to share their money with the next generation. And I think this is a big problem. And sometimes I think this is the big fear which a lot of founders have, that once you give the money to an investor, he's going to end up micromanaging you, treat you like a puppet, and tell you what to do and what not to do, and will not be able to share your vision. And sometimes this is what happens. You think you're between a rock and a hard place. पैसा लो तो भी problem है, पैसा नहीं है तो भी problem है. So what do? And I think sometimes this is what you feel you need to have. Literally 10 heads like Ravan to be able to manage all these things. Not easy at all. But the problem with having 10 heads is you try to do too much. And I think the secret for success is what I think is focus. You've got to learn what to say no to. Because when you have a blank sheet of paper, you can think of 50 different things. But if you try doing too many of them, you'll end up doing none of them successfully. So the trick is to say, this is the one thing which I'm going to do far better than anyone else. And if you don't, otherwise you'll be a bit like this rope. And it's easy to snap. And the reality is that lots of startups will have lots of near-death experiences. And unfortunately, you will not always have doctors able to provide the defibrillation and get you back to life. This is part of the emotional roller coaster ride. The trouble in India is we think of failure as being a bad thing. Oh, he's failed, he's useless. And I think that's the big mistake. Someone who's failed is actually much smarter than someone who's never made the attempt before. Because, sure, he'll make other mistakes, but he won't repeat those mistakes again. I think sometimes this is really, really important. And I think this is the great thing about being an entrepreneur. You get a chance to read a lot, you get a chance to write, and most importantly, you get a chance to learn during this process. So that whether your startup succeeds or it doesn't, I promise you one thing, you will definitely have become a far better person at the end of your startup journey, irrespective of whether you make tons of money or not. That is a secondary consideration. Conferences like this are a great way to learn. But you know what? You shouldn't be learning from people like me. You should be learning from each other. And that's what he meant about the peer-to-peer learning. And there's a lot of that. And usually entrepreneurs are quite generous and are happy to share. This is what my mental image of an entrepreneur is. You know, really, I'm not saying this guy is Superman. He may grow up into being Superman or he may not. But at least he has that dream in his head that that's what he wants to be. This is an important slide because I think the one thing missing in the Indian startup ecosystem is trust and respect. And both the entrepreneur and the investor need to be able to do that for each other. So that, you could become a big fish in a small pond. You could grow up to become a big fish in a big pond. The most important thing is we all need to work together so that, at some point, this is what the ultimate success stories is. This is what my email address is. This is what our website is. And one thing we try to be is as transparent as possible so that founders understand what we are looking for. Honestly, it may sound very exciting, sexy when you read all the Times of India articles. No one tells you about the hours of hard work, the hours of doubt, the uncertainty when you've run out of money. You don't know whether you're going to be able to pay next month's salaries. But this is as much part of being a startup journey. But the good thing is that in India, you have a great opportunity to be able to change a lot of things for the better. And that's some of the stuff we're going to discuss during our panel discussion. Why the Indian healthcare system is so completely broken today. And why startup founders can do so much in order to heal a system which is now starting to become sicker and sicker day by day. Thank you.